It's a beautiful but very cold winter afternoon. We have had some rough weather lately, and it's been snowy and icy, and some tree limbs snapped off and some trees fell down all around, so we've had some power outages and don't have power right now, besides the generator that you might hear very well in this video. But I hope nonetheless you will enjoy this video. I wanted to continue talking about the rest of these books in this video. Hopefully I will get through all of them, and I hope you enjoy. Alright, I'll start talking about a book that I actually listened to on audio, but I have a copy of it. It is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, and as I said, I've listened to this on audio. It's a very, very thick book. There are about 500 pages, so it's a lot to go through, and audio just made it so much quicker and easier for me. So this book is set during World War II, and it talks about Maury Luray, who lives with her father, and she is blind. It's interesting in the way the author was able to describe and just really relate the life of a blind girl. Was able to describe her life, her feelings, her thoughts, and her experiences just by a sense of smell, by a sense of touch. It was wonderfully written. I sometimes felt like I'm actually watching a movie. So besides this girl, there's also a character who is a German orphan boy, and then there is a Nazi officer who is looking for this hidden diamond. And the girl's father, he worked in a museum that held this hidden diamond, so he suspects that this girl or father have it. So it's very well written. It goes back and forth between different characters, and it takes just a few pages of each. So the chapters can be super short. I would recommend listening to it if you do listen to audios, just because it's easier and not as long to get through. Here is a non-fiction Christian living book, a devotional type of book. This is Guyon Speaks Again, and this is a rather old writing. This is by Jeanne Guyon. I believe she lived during the 18th century, so these writings go way back. There's just various chapters on just the Christian life. I'll just show a few of them to you. Found this book at a thrift store for like 25 cents, and I didn't know anything about this author. I didn't know who she was, what this book is about, but I just thought I should keep it, and I'm so glad I did, because it's just so worth reading. It what reminds me of A.W. Tozer's writings, and no wonder, because she corresponded with a man whose name was Fenelon. And this person was actually someone who really influenced A.W. Tozer. So it's interesting how their writings and their lives influenced one another. I did not underline a lot of things here. It's because if I would, every page would be underlined, almost every paragraph, just because it was so good and so deep and rich and spiritual thoughts. There's one I can read for you. The complete death of self does not happen instantly. It is not finished until everything of the old nature is consumed. Die to live. Lose yourself, and you will find yourself again. In doing this, you will begin to experience the new life. There's just a lot of thoughts on just surrendering to God, embracing the will of God, and giving yourself completely to God, following His word. Here's another thought. A single word spoken sweetly and humbly as Christ directs will do more in correcting others than many words spoken out of your own wisdom. The next book was a contemporary fiction, Love and a Little White Lie by Tammy L. Gray. This is a story about January Sanders, and she was in a relationship and just recently had a heartbreak, so she decides to accept a temporary position at a church. But the thing is, she does not believe in God. She's not a Christian, and she decides to so she keeps these doubts about faith to herself and decides to work as a staff there. Then there are a few guys she meets, and then there's romance, and as well as her struggles. I thought this book would have more spiritual content, that her spiritual life would be the primary focus on. Nonetheless, I've seen a lot of people enjoyed this story. Next book is a non-fiction as well. This is a Christian biography, autobiography of Eugenia Price. The Burden is Light, and I did not know much about this author as well. I believe I had some devotional book written by her, but nothing else. So this was also kind of just a random book I picked up at a thrift store, but I'm so glad I picked it up because this was such a interesting testimony of her life, her conversion to Christianity, just how she was such an atheist. She would drink and smoke and just be completely against God, and then through various influences she decided to follow Christ, and how she says the burden is light, His burden is light, living as a Christian. And so it transformed her life, and she became a radio host, and she wrote a few Christian books. So this was an interesting book about her life, and I look forward to reading more of her writings. I mentioned this person in a previous video, and here is Johnny Erickson Tada. So now she is married. This is her love story, her story of how she met her husband, Ken, how they got married, and then their life together, day-to-day life, the struggles they face. This is a really good read for those whose disability. This is a really good read, encouraging read, because it's not easy, and here they share their experience and struggles and the lessons they learn, and just the reality of living a life together, especially with a disability. So the next story is also a contemporary Christian book. This is a story about two love stories, two couples, and I can't say precisely what this is about. I don't remember exactly, but I did enjoy that it wasn't overly romantic. I was quite surprised to see one of my favorite books mentioned in this story. It was The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom, which was one of my favorite reads of this year as well. And this book had a message of grace and accepting imperfection. This next book is also a contemporary book, The Edge of Belonging by Amanda Cox, and it was interesting how this story started out. A very unusual way. It starts out of a homeless man walking by the road, and he comes across a child, an infant, and he picks him up. It's actually a girl, and he finds her, and he decides to save her And then the story goes on how he rescued her, and then goes forward into the future, how she is grown up, and then she goes back to her hometown and tries to figure out this story about her childhood. So it was very interesting and just kind of made me more sensitive. It inspires a more compassion for the homeless, because not all of them might be as they seem. They also have a heart and compassion and care for other human beings. I'll mention the next two books. These are Christian living books, Victory Over Darkness and Slaying the Giant of Fear. Slaying the Giant of Fear talks about the different fears we have in our lives and how to overcome them using the word, the scripture. And as it says in the back cover, this book will have you roaring like a lion at the first sign of fear, and the devil will run in fear. The next book is actually a Christian fiction book that I won at a giveaway from an author, and this is an ARC Advanced Reader copy by Sarah E. Ladd, The Light at Wyncliffe. I mentioned this book in a previous video and I enjoyed reading it. The Regency romance set in the 1800s, and it takes the reader to the Wyncliffe estate located near a dangerous coast. There are multiple shipwrecks, and then there is suspicious activity related to those shipwrecks. So the main characters, there's some romance going on, and then there's also this mystery to solve, why these shipwrecks happen so often and who is behind them and what exactly happens there. This was the first book I read by Sarah E. Ladd, and I think I would enjoy reading some more of her books. So the next book was by an author that I mentioned before in my previous video, A.W. Tozer, The Fire of God's Presence. I have really enjoyed his other book, The Pursuit of God, and so I was rather excited to get to read this one, and it was also very, very good. This one spoke more on Moses and the burning bush and how he approached this burning bush, and he approached God. This book speaks on revival and the revival that needs to happen today, and the reverence and sacredness that is missing in the lives of Christian people nowadays. The next book is also a non-fiction autobiography book by Tom White. This is God's Missiles Over Cuba, and this is his story of since he would fly over a country, over Cuba, and drop off various Christian pamphlets and to be able to that way share the gospel. And then one time his plane crashed and he was arrested and imprisoned for some time, and so he shares his experience of imprisonment and ministry in prisons and his struggles there, as well, and the lessons he learned. This was an interesting and insightful read. I learned some things about the communist Cuba at that time, and this was around the 1990s, 1980s. Here's another autobiography. This one is more of a contemporary one. This is In Pursuit of Love by Rebecca Bender, and I have been reading a few books on human trafficking and survival stories, and this was one of them. I enjoyed reading it. It was very insightful. In this book, Rebecca shares her story, how she was lured into prostitution and how she tried to escape it, but it was very difficult, and then just after various attempts, with God's help, she was able to escape. In this book, there's a lot of details of how the underground world of sex trafficking works, especially in the big cities, and how hard it is for girls to escape. The next book, Awakening Wonder by Sally Clarkson. I really enjoyed reading this book. I have read before books by Clarkson. I was looking forward to this one, and this one was a really good book. This one is focused more on how to awaken the wonder in a child's heart and to inspire this love of learning in their hearts. And this book is good not only for mothers and teachers, but I was also inspired to want to learn more and to have this wonder of life. Next book was a contemporary Christian fiction, The Key to Love by Betsy Ament. This book is about a baker, and it includes coffee, pastries, and enemy to lover romance. So if you like those, you might enjoy this book. I am not a fan much of contemporary books, so it's really hard for me sometimes to get into the mood of reading them, but I think this one sets up a perfect mood during the Valentine season. Next book is The Conqueror by Brad Litvin. This is a rather thick and big book, but I got through all of it, and unfortunately I cannot say that I loved it as much as I hoped to. There were some things that I did not like that were in there. For example, there were gruesome word descriptions, just some. Also, there were some theological things that I couldn't agree with, and sometimes the dialogue was rather modern, in my opinion. I thought it sounded more contemporary rather than this biblical time era. There are various reviews online, so if you would like to read more about what people thought about this book, I think you'll find some really good reviews. There are some really good reviews on Goodreads that I've seen and read and completely agree with them. This book, The Love Note, was the first read for me by Joanna Davidson Palatino, and I really enjoyed this book. It was beautifully written. It was a story of this girl finding a love note in her old desk that got lost, and she goes back to the home where this letter might be from, and she works there for some time trying to figure out who was the author and who this letter belongs to. And then she comes across her own love. Was beautifully written, and I have a few pages in my reading journal of the quotes and the things that I really enjoyed from this book. Another book that I highly enjoyed was by Davis Bunn, Burden of Proof. This was a really touching book. This is about a man who goes back in time. So this is a time travel book, and he goes back to his youth and the time when his brother was shot, and so he tries to prevent that from happening and change the course of life. And so he goes back and he's able to prevent this murder from happening. And then it's just very touching idea of how specific things affect life, how specific events change the course of life, and how we are responsible for these choices, decisions that we make. And it also points out the importance of having good relationship with family, with people, and just kind of puts things into perspective more. That was a really, really good read for me. Another autobiography, The Cross and the Switchblade by David Wilkerson. I have read this one before, so this was a reread for me, and I listened to it on audio as well. So this is a story about David Wilkerson. He worked with drug addicts in New York, and he started this organization, Teen Challenge, working with drug addicts. And this is also a story about Nikki Cruz. So there's a whole movie based on this book that I've seen before, and it's very interesting how God led him to this ministry and used him in this ministry. This Jesus at the Door by Scott McNamara. This was an interesting book. I actually needed it at the time that I read it. In this book, Scott described his way of sharing the gospel and how he uses this small card. This card, he walks through it with a person, an individual just on the street, and how he is able to just simply lead a person to Christ. So I found it interesting, his approach, his methods of ministry and evangelism. Here is yet another autobiography of a man imprisoned with ISIS, Faith in the Face of Evil. This is by Peter Jacek, and this is his story of how he was working for the VOM, Voice of the Martyrs, and he was a journalist visiting various places of the world. In this book, he was visiting Sudan, and he was just about to leave back to his homeland. The airport, he was stopped by the security, and then his computer, phone, everything was confiscated, and so he was imprisoned for basically doing this ministry for his faith. And so he was imprisoned with ISIS, and he tells his experience in prison, how he shared the gospel with other prisoners and how God used him there as well. This was a very recent experience, actually. This was from about 5 years ago to 2015-16. So it's kind of reveals to the reader just how real persecution is in other places of the world. Even though there is so much religious freedom in the country we live in, still so many Christians face persecution and just don't have the same freedom. Okay, and I am getting to the end of my stack. Here is a book that I marked so many pages. This is by Searching by Isabel Cook. This is a story about Isabel, her spiritual journey from doubt to faith, and how her faith was strengthened, and she shares various experiences, how she came to knowing God more and the things of the world that she let go of. She was actually a missionary to China, and so this is just the beginning of her journey. And last but not least is another reread. This is A Shadow of the Almighty, and I love Elizabeth Elliot's writings. I really like this book. As you can see, there's so many different quotes and things that stood out to me and spoke to me. Someone is not familiar, this is a biography of Jim Elliot. He was a missionary to the Auca Indians, and him and his wife, they went to South America to share the gospel with the natives, and so he lost his life there. He was killed by the natives, but this book tells about his youth, the life lessons he learned of radically living for God. Even though I read this book before, it still spoke to me, and I found other lessons that were applicable in my life now than when I read before. So I highly, highly recommend reading this book and just learning all these lessons from his life as well. So that was my huge stack of half of the books that I read in 2020. And to summarize, if I was to choose just a few of my favorite reads from 2020, I would choose The Blue Castle by Montgomery. Another one would be The Burden of Proof by Davis Bunn, The Insanity of God by Nick Ripkian, Evidence Not Seen by Darlene Daibler Rose, The God Smuggler by Brother Andrew, The Pursuit of God by A.W. Tozer. I enjoyed most of the autobiographies and biographies I read, so it's hard to choose just a few favorites from those. I also really enjoyed The Love Note. That was a good read by Joanna Davidson Politano. Also the book by Jian Guyan. I really was inspired and encouraged by that book. A Mosaic of Wings by Kimberly Duffy was a bright and beautiful book. There's also a book that I did not mention in this video. I don't have a copy of it, but it was Stepping Heavenward by Elizabeth Prentice. It was a reread for me, and I really enjoyed that book. It's always a good read. Another one, More Than We Remember by Christine Susan Nelson. So that is all for my reads of 2020, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I hope it encouraged you and you found some new books that you would like to read, or some books that you do own but you never got to them. I hope you do get to them sooner and enjoy them and are inspired to read more. So have a lovely rest of your day, and I hope you join me in the next video. Bye.